If this is supposed to be the bad game of the series, I think we're probably in pretty good hands going forward.
From here on out, it's gonna be nothing but smooth sailing.
Welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to the Zelda Marathon, where I play through every mainline Zelda game, and I come back and I share with you guys my thoughts and opinions. Last time we talked about the first entry of the series, which hey, if you haven't watched that video yet, I think it's definitely something you should consider checking out. Or, you know, be like Nintendo and basically forget almost everything about the first one and essentially start completely fresh with the sequel. Yep, that's right. Today we're going to be talking about Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, which for a long time has been considered the black sheep of the franchise, for better or for worse. Everything you can look at this game just makes it stick out like a sore thumb from the rest of the series. From the experience points and minor RPG aspects, to the fact that it's the only mainline game to not have The Legend of Zelda in the title, to the difficulty. Oh, the difficulty. We're going to look at that a little bit later. But first things first, I want to check out how this game's perception has actually evolved over time, because this might actually be the most polarizing game in the Zelda franchise. When it comes to looking at older reviews for games, I always sort of take things with a bit of a larger grain of salt than I do more contemporary reviews and opinions. Like, it's definitely important to think about what the gaming landscape looked like back then, but it also seems like a lot of older video game reviews were designed to advertise and sell you on something first, rather than informing the reader of a game's level of quality. Some would even say not much has really changed. Like, do you really think that the first-party Nintendo game and an issue of Nintendo Power is going to get its fair and objective piece instead of trying to push it on to kids who are basically looking to be told what to play? No, of course not. Nintendo Power awarded Zelda 2 as their Game of the Year for 1988, and I mean, come on, sit there and tell me you think that Zelda 2 is a better game than Mario 2, Contra, or even the original Mega Man. You know there's probably something more going on here. Regardless of my bitching, critics seemed to really like Zelda 2 at the time. It reviewed pretty well, it placed pretty highly on lists that were detailing the best Nintendo, NES, and even some of the best games of all time, with many publications calling this game an absolute masterpiece. I don't really see it that way. I touched on my experience with Zelda 2 briefly in my last video, as I had initially played this as a part of the Zelda collection back on the GameCube back in the early 2000s. I was already a fan of the series at this point, playing Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask on my N64, and when I had the collection and I saw Zelda 2 was on there, it was something else that I really wanted to try. So how do you think my first playthrough of Zelda 2 went?
Not good.
I got my absolute shit rocked in nearly every direction I went. I tried fighting enemies and I could just not wrap my brain around the combat. I went to a few caves and was confused as to why I was getting attacked by invisible enemies. I went into town and spoke to NPCs that spouted complete nonsense. I had no idea where to go, and I would die over and over and over again. So I never finished it, and I booted up Majora's Mask for my 12th playthrough and never considered touching it again. Yeah, while I always had some sort of interest in trying to get back into the first game, I never bothered grabbing Zelda 2 on the Virtual Console or an emulator because I thought that game was just going to be too hard for me. Until today. This time around, I sat down and played the game to completion, and yeah, I like the first Zelda more. Zelda 2 isn't a bad game, mind you. I think it is perfectly playable and honestly does a few things that were quite a bit ahead of its time, but I also can't really sit here and say that this game doesn't have its faults, and unfortunately its biggest flaw is going to be the absolute massive barrier of entry that is the difficulty. Now, when this game came out in the late 80s, where most games are already tough as nails, I can see there being a bit more of a solid fan base existing, since Zelda 2 probably wasn't that much harder than the average game. When you compare it to games nowadays, especially with the more recently released Zelda titles, that's where we see the gap. I don't think most people play Zelda for the challenge, and for many, that's Zelda 2's defining feature. It's the hard one. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics with the difficulty in the combat section of this video, but just know when someone says that they don't like Zelda 2, there's a pretty high chance that that might actually be the reason. So here we are on to the next game of our marathon, which, hey, by the way, if you guys haven't already, you should consider subscribing so that way you can be notified right away whenever a new Zelda video goes live. I'm going to be covering every mainline Zelda game, and I might have a couple surprises for some side games thrown in there, so you're going to want to stay tuned for that. But we'll get to those games another time. We've got a lot to discuss today. So without further ado, this is my review for Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. In a rare instance for the series, we actually have a game that takes place immediately after the events of the previous one. Well, I say immediately, but really a few years have passed and Link is now a bit older at the age of 16. And while some people grow hair in weird spots, Link's coming of age sign has him bear the symbol of the Triforce on the back of his hand. He goes and shows this to Impa, who takes him to a chamber that reveals a sleeping princess. This is Princess Zelda, But not the first Princess Zelda that we saved, this is the other Princess Zelda that has been put under a sleeping spell for years after her brother and an allied wizard attempted to find the location of the Triforce, but could not get her to reveal its whereabouts. The brother, feeling guilty about this, made a decree that all princesses be named Zelda going forward in order to show remembrance for this tragedy. That must line up pretty nice with like the 5 or 6 Zeldas that came before this, but I digress. Impa gives Link a scroll that while is in a language that he hasn't seen before, he can actually read. And he must set out to return the 6 crystals to the various palaces around Hyrule in order to claim the Triforce of Courage and awaken Zelda. Oh, and also, Ganon's minions want to kill Link's ass and douse Ganon's ashes with Link's blood in order to revive him. Yeah, this series can be a little hardcore sometimes. But yeah, that's our basic setup. And just like the first game, we get all this explained to us either through the manual, the opening text scroll, or the final cutscene. It's a pretty bog standard plot, with maybe the only remarkable thing being that we don't actually have an antagonist this time around. Like, Ganon's revival is the closest thing, I guess, but that's more of the result of us failing our quest rather than an actual opposing entity, you know? Like, the only time you ever see Ganon is when you get a game over and he hits you with the... I mean, we also get introduced to Dark Link, who would make numerous appearances later on in the series, but he's not exactly a character as much as he is a test for us, if that makes any sense. Oh well. I will say, it's at least cool to see how Hyrule has progressed since the first game, with a lot of signs of civilization coming back, such as roads and towns. It really makes everything feel much more like an actual kingdom, rather than a random series of caves that people were hiding in before. Overall, it's an NES game story, it's a cliff note in the Zelda timeline, there's not too much to really go over here. It's fine, but people aren't really coming back to Zelda 2 for the plot or the world building. Now, what some people might be coming back to Zelda 2 for is the gameplay. And let me just say right away, what a weird departure this game is from everything that we saw with Zelda 1. Like, if you didn't know anything about Zelda and I showed you these two games side by side, would you honestly think these games were even related? I sure as shit wouldn't, especially with the next two games being basically an extension of what was already established in Zelda 1. The progression between Zelda 1 and 2 often gets compared to the situation that was going on at the same time with Castlevania 1 and Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, but I don't think that's exactly a one-to-one comparison. My main reason for this being that while Simon's Quest deviated a bit from Castlevania 1, it was still a side-scrolling action platformer at the end of the day. The RPG elements it did add would eventually go on to be one of the series' defining traits after it was adopted by Symphony of the Night. So you can see the influence there even if it wasn't immediately direct. With Zelda 2, it almost sits in this weird bubble where there are a couple things that pop up in later games such as music tracks, names of towns, and of course Dark Link, but basically next to nothing from the gameplay was brought over unless you count the CDI games, which you better fucking not be. Other than that, most of the games it's had its direct influence on kind of come from weird places such as other NES games, indie titles, or this random Adventure Time game. Like, what is this thing? Zelda 2 isn't the top-down puzzle-solving item-utilizing adventure of the first game, but instead places a much larger focus on a strategic combat style, implements a live-based system like other NES games, and focuses more on Link gaining experience points and magic spells for his progression, all the while talking with many of the game's NPCs. There really wasn't another game like Zelda 2 out at the time, and very few have actually been like this game since. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'll leave that up for you to decide. But I do want to dive a little bit more into some of these mechanics because Zelda 2 is such an interesting and weird game to talk about, so let's hop into this. For all intents and purposes, Zelda 2 is one of the first action RPG games ever made. Which, this is my favorite genre of game. I absolutely love the combination of RPG progression systems mixed in with some real-time deep combat. And Zelda 2 is one of the first to ever do it. We see a lot more acknowledgement for the first action RPG thrown around for games in either the Ys or Mana series, but technically Zelda 2 predates those games by a few years. It's admittedly kind of bare bones, but hey, for one of the first attempts, I think it does a pretty okay job overall. So when defeating enemies in the overworld or occasionally grabbing these bags with the letter P on them that I hope stands for points, you gain experience. You can use the experience points to either increase Link's defenses so he takes less damage, his magic so his spells consume less mana, or his sword so he can do more damage himself. Let me just say right now, you really do want to level up all of these stats at some point, but maybe one of them has a bit more of an attraction towards you than the other. So what can you do about that? Well, Well, thankfully, you actually do have the option to choose which points you want to allocate to what stat, with the only issue being that the Western release has different point requirements for each of the stats, with health being the lowest while attack being the highest. This means that when the level up prompt comes up, you have to choose to hold on to these points for later rather than spend them on an upgrade you want now. The Japanese version of Zelda 2 instead has all the stats be valued the same, with the caveat that if you die, all of your stats are lowered to the lowest one you currently have. So if you have a 2 in health, but a 4 and 5 in magic and strength, you'll be knocked down to 2s across the board. Kind of a brutal punishment, but thankfully in the Western release, you just sort of end up losing whatever XP you were working on towards your next level up if you were to lose all of your lives, which I think is a bit more fair. There are also a few enemies that drain your XP on contact, which are definitely annoying, especially considering that they're some of the ones that are the hardest to avoid, but I digress. This freedom really does allow you to build Link in whichever way you want, even if a lot of the late game dungeons really do require you to have a certain magic amount. I will say that I personally leveled my stats as they came up, since they all had pretty equal importance to me, and I never really had to spend a single instance of grinding in order to finish this game. There also exists some extra upgrades throughout the world, such as heart containers for increasing your health and magic potions for increasing your magic capacity. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next section, but Zelda 2 does a much better job of not necessarily needing a guide like some people might need it for the first game, but I'd recommend at least having one on standby, because these potions are a requirement for getting a necessary spell to open up an area for an item for a later palace, and if you didn't find them all, like I didn't, you're gonna need to backtrack. I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the more obtuse things that this game has in the next section of this video, but I'll wrap up this one by saying that the RPG aspects are a little bare bones, but they're an important step to get to where we are today. So next time that you're playing a Kingdom Hearts or a Diablo or an Elder Scrolls title, just keep in mind that Zelda 2 kind of paved the way for those games to even exist in a way, even if that influence isn't immediately clear. One of the other big shakeups from Zelda 1 to 2 was the split of the gameplay having the overworld exploration and the side-scrolling combat segments. Starting with the overworld map, we can see that we have a much more scaled up version of Hyrule to explore that feels much closer to exploring the overworld in an early Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest game than it does Zelda 1. Actually, a cool little Easter egg is that the entirety of Zelda 1's map is condensed down in this little area right here, which you can cross in a couple of seconds. I think that probably shows best how different this overworld is handled between these two games. Zelda 1's was considered a true open world at the time, while Zelda 2 has much more of a representation of a world with the actual gameplay taking place in instant side-scrolling sections. There are still some secrets and stuff to find, like the occasional square that you have to step on for an optional item or secret entrance, but for the most part, you don't really explore or interact with the overworld at the same level of depth you did in Zelda 1. There are still a couple of things in the overworld to consider, such as moving slowly through swamp tiles or having to move strategically to avoid enemies, but that's kind of it. The most you really have here are pathways that are blocked that you need to get a key item in order to progress towards, which in turn makes Zelda 2 a much more linear experience than the first game. You can be the judge if that's a good or a bad thing. Seriously, the structure of this game this time around essentially has you get a key item from a palace and then move on to the next one by clearing something off of the overworld. Rinse and repeat. It's because of this that I don't think you really need a guide like you did in Zelda 1. It's pretty straightforward, except for the few times that it's not. Yeah, we still have the occasional Zelda 1 head scratchers, like finding the hidden town in the forest by using your hammer on a random patch of trees in this section. Like, why would anyone think to do that? The only hint that you get is that there's a hidden village somewhere in a forest, but that doesn't even really narrow it down to this section of trees. And even then, who the fuck would think to use a hammer here? Or there's the previously mentioned fact that you need to find every single one of the magic potion enhancements in order to unlock a spell that opens up a secret entrance at the edge of this town. Which, by the way, your only hint on what to do here is that some old lady says that there's a secret there. You have to figure out that you randomly need to cast a spell there. Or how about knowing to crouch down by this table to find this mirror? The only hint that you get is this lady tells you that she lost her mirror and you aren't even given a direction to go. You're just supposed to crouch and check this area without ever really needing to do that anywhere else in the game. Thankfully, that's about it when it comes to those weird instances where I think a guide is needed, but they're just nonsensical enough that I think you should at least consider having one in your back pocket. Outside of the overworld areas, we also have the side-scrolling sections, which you'll see during combat segments and whenever you're exploring a palace or a town. This is where the different control schemes take over, which I'll talk a little bit more about when it comes to the combat section of this video, but to focus on the more exploration side of things, I think the biggest addition that we see here is Link's ability to jump. This creates a lot more opportunities, not just for combat, but for platforming too. You're not going to get Kaizo levels of insane platforming by any means, but you are going to have to deal with some challenges that you never had to in the first game. Jumping over projectiles, going over fake floors, avoiding bits of falling ceilings, and making your way across bottomless pits. Oh, how I hate those fucking bottomless pits. It's not so much the jumps itself as the enemies, which again, I'll get into in the next section of this video, don't you worry. The dungeons, or palaces as they're called in this game, I think are pretty well done for the most part. They often have a decent number of secrets and alternative paths to take, they are filled to the brim with challenges, and the music is one of the best themes in any Zelda game, don't at me. They'll also host a lot of combat areas baked into the level design, but if you find yourself getting caught in the overworld in combat, you'll be put into an instance section that is basically just flat terrain with a small selection of enemies. Then there are the towns, one of the other new additions that are honestly something that's always worth stopping by. You don't have any shops or anything like that in this game. Actually, come to think of it, there's no currency either. That's kind of weird, huh? But you do get plenty of buildings to go into, NPCs to interact with, and yes, you can always talk to the town prostitutes to refill your health and your magic. The NPCs actually take a much larger role this time, actually giving Link some sort of semblance of direction. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a step up over Zelda 1. Now certain NPCs that require an item or an objective to be finished to progress will straight up tell you that they need something. It's by no means the most involved dialogue, but it does a fine enough job of at least giving you some idea of what to do, with a healthy dose of random NPC bullshit babble thrown in for good measure. You know, I can't really say for certain if I like all these changes to the formula or not. While some things like the additions of towns, more dungeon obstacles, and NPCs that have a little bit more to say are obvious pluses, the whole split gameplay between a top-down overworld and side-scrolling segment doesn't really do it for me. I feel like we just lost a little bit too much when it comes to the adventure piece when we're going through the overworld, so I kind of prefer Zelda 1 in this regard. Now we're getting to the good stuff, the combat, and this can basically be broken down into 3 categories: the control, the enemies, and the difficulty. Let's start with the control first, because for as many issues as I have with Zelda 2, actually playing with the combat isn't one of them. It's actually pretty good. For an NES game, I really struggle to think of any other game that has as deep of a combat system as Zelda 2 does. The way that it essentially works this time around is that Link can either attack high or low, which is determined whether he's crouching or not. While he is doing that, he will also automatically block with his shield in that direction. This is the basic fundamental system, as you're going to be expected to throw out some shots, while you are also blocking projectiles and melee attacks against yourself. You'll also be able to attack in the air, which, trust me, you're going to want to learn how to do jump attacks properly for a number of enemies in this game, if you hope to clear them out as efficiently as possible. Later on, Link will also unlock some new sword abilities, including the supremely useful downward mid-air stab to pogo off of enemies, and on the other end of the spectrum, an upward thrust that I think I may have used a total of 2 times. Oh yeah, speaking of useless, the sword beam is here too if Link is at full health, but considering it only damages smaller enemies, and you are basically always on death's door in this game, I almost completely forgot it existed. All of this turns the relatively simple combat of the first game of just pressing one button and occasionally pressing the second button to throw an item out into something that almost feels like an early rendition of a beat 'em up or a fighting game. Now, instead of clearing out a room of 5+ enemies, you'll have to take out enemies one by one in much more intimate encounters. It's a legitimately great system, which given the amount of enemies we have this time around, makes the interplay surprisingly pretty deep. Yeah, just look at the roster of enemies we have. These can essentially fit into 4 camps. Can you guys tell I like putting things in the little boxes? These are as follows: enemies that are a non-issue, more challenging enemies that you have to fight in a certain way, super annoying enemies, and bosses. Now, most of the enemies in this game fall into the non-issue category. They are typically killed in 1 to 2 hits, they don't do a whole lot of damage, they're just typically there to add as an extra obstacle to your main challenge. Think of stuff like the bats or the blobs or the Octoroks. Next up are the more challenging enemies. These are typically higher HP and damaging monsters that also can sometimes have some form of defense that you'll have to play around. This will include stuff like crouch stabbing the Stalfos, jump attacking the Iron Knuckle, or downward stabbing the Doom Knockers. Then you have the fucking annoying enemies. These guys aren't necessarily hard and can usually be killed in 1 to 2 hits, but they either come in large groups or are just really hard to hit for one reason or another, or come at super inopportune times like when you're platforming or fighting something more dangerous. This is stuff like the bubbles, who are usually around platforms or tight spaces that drain your magic if you get hit, or the floating dog heads who endlessly spawn and shoot projectiles, or the tektites that can only be killed with a particular spell, or yeah, these fucking guys, because they fly fast as shit, do way more damage than you think they should, and they also drain your XP. These guys suck. Then finally, we have the bosses, which I think is a pretty okay lineup overall. You've got some easy bosses like Horsehead and Darklink, assuming you're like me and did the cheese strat. You've got your more challenging bosses like Guma, Barba, and Rebonak that will require you to hit them at more opportune times. And then you have some really stupid ass bosses like Karok and Thunderbird that require that you use a certain spell to even be able to damage them. Not enough mana to cast that spell, or hell, you don't have that spell unlocked in the first place? Well, have fun dying, shithead. Hope you had an extra life or you're getting set back to the starting area of the game. Which, yeah, I think it's time we talk about that difficulty. This game is fucking hard. Some legitimate difficulty and some absolute bullshit. I think I did a good enough job of explaining the legitimate difficulty for a number of enemies requiring you to approach them a certain way or how it's important for you to learn the combat system, so let's just move right into the bullshit. First, let's talk about the enemy AI. This is like some Mortal Kombat 2 Shao Kahn levels of bullshit input reading. So pretty much every enemy in this game is going to be reading your inputs at all times in order to make sure that their attacks land or they block whatever you're doing. For instance, you might be trying to approach a blob to kill it, and it will purposely stay still until you are just close enough that it's able to get a sucker punch off on you. Or these asshole Azalfos who sit over this fence and throw shit at you with pinpoint precision. Then there's enemies like the Iron Knuckles who will block literally every attack, turning the encounter with them into a game of Rock'em Sock'em Robots. That jump attack that I mentioned earlier, yeah, that's actually a way to exploit the AI into blocking low while you attack high. But fuck it, this game isn't pulling any punches, so neither should I. If you just had to fight a couple of those tougher enemies here and there, while you occasionally took some pot shots from some smaller goons, it wouldn't be so bad. But that's not the world we live in. When you travel through a palace or a cave, you are fighting dozens of these guys. The final palace is notoriously challenging for it being a gauntlet of tough monsters, but shit, I think the trek through Death Mountain in the early game was my breaking point. This section just went on for way too long, and you are starved of resources by the time you get to the other side. Yeah, enemies will occasionally drop some bottles to refill your magic, but health? Nah, fuck that. You better waste all that magic we're giving you on your healing spell, you piece of shit. But if it sounds like enemies dropping you to zero is going to be the thing that does you in the most, let me be the first to tell you that every time you take damage in this game, you experience knockback. You know where this is going. This will probably be the thing that you die to the most, since the bottomless pits are always an instant kill, and given that there are plenty of instances that you're going to need to platform while annoying flying enemies can get you, those Castlevania comparisons that I talked about earlier are starting to make a bit more sense. Seriously, there is no worse feeling in this game than to be so deep in a palace only to fall into a bottomless pit and have your last life be lost and return to the beginning. Oh, that's right, by the way, there's a live system too. Of course there is. Now, NES games are no stranger to live systems, and we're all pretty familiar with how they work too. You have a set number of lives, usually around 3 or so, and if you run out of them, you get set back to a predetermined point, typically being at the beginning of the game or at least at the beginning of a recent set of levels. It's an old system, and I think I speak for a lot of modern players when I say it's kind of an archaic and unnecessary way to make a game harder than it actually is. So how does Zelda 2 implement it? Well, if you lose all of your lives, you go back to the beginning area of the game, you lose all of your current XP, and you have to walk all the way back to where you were. Outside of the final palace of the game, there are no checkpoints. None. If you die, and you will fucking die, you get sent all the way back to the beginning area, and you've got to walk all the way back to where you were to try again. All this does is waste your time. There's no two ways to slice it. This game's got some bullshit difficulty. And again, not everything that is hard about this game is cheap. I'm fine with fighting some of the more demanding enemies and bosses, and even the occasional gauntlet of caves or palaces are okay, but the AI for a lot of enemies is overtuned way too much for the average player. Having instant kill pits and knockback in a game like this is cheap bullshit, and the run back to later areas after losing all of your lives just wastes your time and it's unnecessarily cruel. This is my biggest issue with this game, because while the difficulty can sometimes feel rewarding, more often than not, it just feels fucking cheap. You can call me a casual or go down in the comments and say that I suck at video games. When I was 10 years old, this is the reason that I quit Zelda 2, and now that we're in the year 2024, I don't think it's really doing that much more for me. We got a couple more things to talk about in this video before we wrap things up, so how about we go over some of Link's new abilities? These can essentially be divided up into two camps, his magic and his items. Now the items, are honestly a pretty big step down from what we saw in Zelda 1. Every time you got something new in the first game, it felt like Zinc? What the fuck? It felt like Zinc was growing in power or versatility, being able to bomb walls, use a boomerang to pick up items from afar, or the magic wand and the bow for long-range combat. You could see how it really made Link more well-rounded to play as. In Zelda 2, you get items in the middle of palaces much like you would in the first game, but they lose a ton of utility that they once had. The hammer, the raft, the whistle, the boots, the candle, these all just essentially serve as different keys to get past major obstacles. Like, they do different things such as the candle lighting dark caves and the boots allowing you to walk on water. Well, some patches of water. Well, that's all they really are at the end of the day, just progression checks, which I'm obviously okay with needing certain items as a prerequisite to do certain things, but the first game and pretty much every later game did a much better job of having these items be used for that, while also giving them some sort of practical purpose. Things do fare a little bit better when it comes to the spells though. Now these you're going to utilize all the damn time, because Zelda 2, like I said, is fucking tough. So these can potentially take a bit of the edge off. Starting off, we have the shield spell, which cuts the damage Link takes in half. If you're smart, you'll be using this all the damn time, especially throughout the palaces. Every time you're in a boss fight, shield spell. Going through Death Mountain, shield spell. Getting pegged by these stupid lizard fucks, shield spell. It's useful in most situations, costs very little mana. Just use it. Next up is the jump spell, which, like you might be able to guess, increases Link's jump height. Some people only think the spell is needed to get to certain areas, and while it is technically true, I think that you should also consider throwing it on every once in a while to breeze by some encounters. It can also help for certain boss fights such as Barba. Next up is the life spell. You cast it and you heal. You don't need me to tell you how important this is, since this is the only way that you can heal in places like palaces. So those are all the spells that you get in the early game, and it's a really solid lineup. You're basically going to use those all the damn time. However, the later spells are pretty lackluster. First up is the fairy spell, which lets Link turn into a fairy and just fly over everything. It's a requirement to reach certain areas, but I was also able to find some utility by turning into it to completely skip platforming sections. Then there is Reflect. You can now reflect certain projectiles with your shield, and it's a requirement to beat Karok. Other than that, I never used it. Then there's also Fire, a spell that shoots a fireball whenever you attack, allowing you to damage certain enemies, which I also basically never used in favor of just running past them. Then there's the spell, which, awful name aside, it basically turns every enemy on screen into a blob and opens a secret at the edge of town. It never got used after this one time. And finally, there's Thunder, which is essentially a screen nuke and is a requirement to damage the Thunderbird, but it also takes up over half of your mana, so you bet your ass I never wasted my time using it. I guess you could say this also kind of contributes to the difficulty of the game, because Link this time around really doesn't have the options that he had in Zelda 1. We of course would see magic return in later games such as Ocarina of Time, and thankfully items were given much more practical uses from here on out, so thankfully it looks like this is a one-off occurrence. Oh yeah, this game has a New Game Plus mode. Oh boy. Zelda 1's second quest is notorious for cranking up the difficulty to an absurd amount and having some of the most elaborately hidden things in any Zelda game so far. So let me ask you, knowing that Zelda 2 is the hard one, what kind of diabolical shit do you think Nintendo cooked up for us? Did they double enemies' damage? Did they make it so experience points require a higher threshold to reach? Did they remix the dungeons to fill them with nothing but Dark Links and Thunderbirds as common enemies? Well, actually no. So when you start the second quest, all of your items, your heart containers, and magic containers are taken away, but you maintain your current experience level and get to keep all the spells you collected on your journey. Enemies aren't any more ruthless, the palace layouts are exactly the same, and you basically just progress through the game as you normally would, albeit at a higher level. I don't know what to say here. Thank you? Like, it almost seems weird to have this New Game Plus mode just be substantially easier than the main game, but hey, as long as I don't have to walk into a wall for 10 seconds or lose a heart to some old fuck in a dungeon, I'll take what I can get. That being said, I don't think there really is that much of a reason to play through the game again. At least with the first game, a lot of the content was actually new. It wasn't great by any means, but it was at least different. This is just Zelda 2 without the progression system, which makes areas like Death Mountain easier in the early game for sure, but outside of that, I wouldn't exactly call it better. Play it if you want. I think it's pretty skippable though. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is a game that I totally see the appeal for, but if I'm being honest with you guys, it's not one that I would say I really enjoyed too much. There are a lot of things to appreciate about Zelda 2, from the expansion of Hyrule with towns and NPCs, to having one of the deepest combat systems an NES game can offer, to being one of the pioneers of the action RPG genre. There are also some minor things that I don't think pan out super well, such as the utilization for items and spells, to the scaled back nature of exploration when compared to the first game, to the still occasional random things you need to do to progress that aren't ever clearly explained. But like I said, the big thing here is the difficulty. Look, I enjoy playing more challenging games. I love most of FromSoft's titles. I love doing higher end content in Final Fantasy XIV. I do like my more relaxed games too from time to time, but I am no stranger to playing things that are going to stretch me as a player. Zelda 2 is a game that I don't think entirely strikes the right balance here. There are just too many things that I consider cheap difficulty for me to honestly say that I'm enjoying what I'm playing. And the penalty for dying only really serves to waste players' time, which I find incredibly annoying. I've played way worse games than this, but as someone who's played most of the other games in the series, I just don't see any reason to really pick this one up over anything else unless you really love the RPG mechanics or are just looking for a tough challenge. It's because of this that I can't really recommend Zelda 2 for most people. I think the people that are going to like Zelda 2 probably already do, and the amount of new people that will play and enjoy this game will just grow smaller and smaller as the years go on. It's not a bad game, but pretty much everything after this looks like it's just going to be much, much better. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite memory of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, maybe consider giving a like and subscribing. Thank you guys again. I'll catch you in the next video.